Never before, and really never again, has there been a crime of this nature actually perpetrated by a woman in Australia.
He woke up to discover that he'd been shot in the head.
Buyers testified that Asquith had actually shot himself as part of a conspiracy by the couple to defraud the insurers. The jury didn't buy the story.
Yeah, could I get an ambulance, please? Well, he's vomiting everywhere. I have a person potentially overdosed on heroin.
Potentially overdosed.
Well, he's vomiting everywhere, blood and stuff.
Well, it's not good if he's vomiting blood.
You could not have written a more bizarre story.
You don't see murder very often occurring among the more privileged young people of the world.
She grabbed hold of my forearm and said, "He had a lot last night."
He took 2.5 days to die. He was tortured.
In October 1997, Anu Singh was a young law student at the Australian National University. But her life was about to unravel. She would go from an intelligent, aspiring lawyer to a defendant on trial for an unusual and calculated murder.
You sit there every day watching a young woman, wondering how it was that that young woman, who's just a few years younger than me, was sitting there accused of murder. Every day, something new coming out that just left you shaking your head. You couldn't actually believe what you were hearing because it just made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
The journey that led to the court that day started in early 1995, when Anu Singh began a relationship with Joe Chinquay.
They met in Newcastle at a night out. Joe had met her during the time she was doing her law degree. They conducted a long-distance relationship for some time, and then they made the decision that Joe would move to Canberra.
Joe Chinquay was a young man from Newcastle, New South Wales. His parents, Maria and Nino, had moved from Italy and had worked hard to build a life in Australia. Growing up, Joe was a keen sportsman and successful at school.
He was very vivacious. He was full of life. He was a real extrovert. He was someone who people were drawn to because he was just such a great guy.
Apparently I was hyperactive. It's probably why they bring me in today.
He graduated from university with a degree in civil engineering and soon after got a job at a firm in his hometown.
He was always happy, always busy. He couldn't stay still. He just had to do 2 or 3 things at a time. I'm not saying this because he's not here, but he had a lot of friends, a lot of friends. He wasn't the type that he start fighting with people like that. You know, he wasn't like that. Actually, if anything, he tried to calm people down.
He never had a bad word to say about anyone, and I think that's what really magnetised him in terms of people just being drawn to him because he was essentially a good person. He wasn't someone who sought confrontation. He was always very social. He could always have a conversation with just about anyone, and I think that's why so many people just thought so much of him.
By 1996, Joe and Anu's relationship had grown into something more serious, and to their friends, the couple appeared perfectly happy together.
The impression I had with Joe and Anu and their relationship was, in the early stages, Joe was very taken by her. Initially, I think it was very physical, the attraction. Anu clearly is not a silly girl. She was studying law. I think that side of it and that academic, intelligence, I think also attracted Joe. So you combine those two things, and I think he was very taken with her. She was very dominant, she was very confident, and that's something that I think drew Joe to her like a moth to the flame.
Anu Singh and Joe Chinque had been in what seemed to everybody to be a really loving relationship. Well, certainly that Joe Chinque was in love with Anu Singh.
However, as time wore on, friends and family began to notice that the relationship was perhaps not all it seemed to be.
The first time I met Anu was at a dinner. The impression I had of her was she was a strange girl. Conversations that we had during the dinner were about the afterlife. Do you believe there's an afterlife? What exists after this world, which is all well and good, but she also spoke about things such as her previous relationship and how intense it was with her previous partner, to Joe. She said they were so close, it was almost incestuous. I didn't know how to react to that. It certainly seemed odd to me, and it was clearly odd to Joe as well, but he said nothing, but it was clear that he was uncomfortable. She just struck me as someone who was looking for a reaction, someone who liked to shock and make an impression. He really did seem dimmed by her. She was always in the foreground, leading the conversation, leading very strange discussions at times, and Joe was always in the background. And this was not the Joe that I knew, that I grew up with.
When Joe met, I call the devil because she's worse than a devil. He wasn't himself anymore. She demanded too much of him.
When I was talking with my son, she was talking somewhere else. Soon she saw my son, Joe, was talking to me, she came and grabbed Joe from his back and started to talk, kiss him, this and that. I thought, not only once, maybe 4, 5, 6 times.
We had a lot of argument on the phone because every night Joe came back from work, I made sure that the food was on the table to eat. We sit on the table eating and talking. And she used to call 10 minutes after we eat, and he stopped eating and talked to her for 1 hour on the phone, every night. Then I started to get very upset about that. Quite a few times, I went to that phone and I said, look, we eat at 6 o'clock in this house. Can you please ring at 7? Let him eat, and then you can talk all night.
Joe changed very quickly when he started dating her, just due to her dominant personality. He either had to submit or he would never have survived 3 weeks with her. And that's what he did. I believe he changed in order to be with her because he really wanted to be with her.
With Anu studying in Canberra and Joe living over 400 kilometres away in Newcastle, the relationship was becoming strained. After months of pressure, Joe finally relented and moved to Canberra to begin a new life with his girlfriend.
We didn't want him to go there. We were so upset. We didn't want Joe to go down there. I was very angry with him. I said, why you want to live? You got your family, you got your friends, your job here.
If Joe Chinque hoped the move to the capital would appease Anu and mend their frail relationship, he was wrong. Anu's personality was becoming more and more difficult for him to deal with.
Anu Singh came across as a young woman who craved that attention from Joe, and that she was creating a drama in her own life that she could be the central character of, and Joe was feeding her need for attention. He was feeding her with compliments. He was feeding her with reassurance. But as time went on, she needed more. She had to up the stakes in the drama, because was Joe getting to a point where he wasn't buying into her drama anymore? Was he getting fed up with having to constantly be there to make sure she knew she was beautiful? And how many times can you say that to somebody before you get fed up with it and you get tired of it? You want someone to get help, but they won't.
Not long after moving to Canberra, it seems that Joe was beginning to question his relationship with Anu. He was growing tired of the emotional roller coaster that was their life together, and he was making plans for a future without her.
I caught up with him probably 2 or 3 times in Canberra, and the last time I caught up with him, he had just bought himself a new car. He had a real spark in his eye over the car, but I also got a sense that maybe there was a new chapter opening up for him, that he was starting to feel more positive about things. He had made a decision that within himself that it's time for me to go. Buying the car was a part of that, and it was an expression of that, and Anu knew it. That's what I believe. And when that paradigm shift came and she understood it was coming, that's when she decided to do what she did.
Less than 3 months later, Jo Cinque would be dead.
She was a very accomplished law student. She'd been an excellent student in high school and yet had laboured under a burden of mental health problems for years. Anu Singh has a history of being an attention-grabbing, attention-seeking girl at her high school, somebody who was more intent than others around her to attract attention in this way. She was focused on her physical appearance. She has a history of struggling when she left the environment of her hometown and went to university in Canberra.
She had problems with eating disorder. She then developed preoccupations with her health. She began to believe that she had terrible diseases, her insides were rotting. At one point she was convinced she had AIDS. So she develops this sense of dying and falling apart, which is part of a depressive illness.
She believed that she had a debilitating disease and that Joe, because he had suggested that she take Ipecac, which was a drug that induces vomiting, that she believed that Joe had caused issues with her health.
Ipecac is a drug that helps you shed weight. At the time, Anu claimed that Joe had suggested to her that she take Ipecac because she was constantly complaining about her weight and that she was overweight. For me, this is completely and utterly incongruent with Joe. Number one, because he never took drugs, and number two, I'm sure he didn't even know what it was.
Whether she just perceived she had illnesses or whether she was deliberately faking these illnesses, I guess that only she can know that. But Anu Singh's come to a point where she felt that her life wasn't worth living, that she was going to end her life and she was going to take him with her for his part in her deteriorating health.
Whatever the reason, Anu Singh began planning the suicide pact, with her and Joe apparently ending their lives together. The first time that Joe's parents had a sense that something was terribly wrong was when Joe failed to make his regular Sunday phone call home.
I had the tea ready and we wait for him to ring. And he didn't ring. So around 5 o'clock, something like that, I rang him. And a strange voice answered the phone. I said, did I ring the wrong number? Who am I speaking to? And he said, sergeant or some police person. I said, what the police do in my son's place? He said, just a minute, please. At the same time, the police knock on our door. The police told me, can you sit down, please? I said, what's going on here? And he said, it's about your son. As soon as I said that, I started screaming, please, don't say anymore. She killed him, did she? She killed him. Straight away I knew she did kill him. I started screaming, please don't tell me it's not true. It can't be true. That's when I knew it. It was a nightmare. It hasn't stopped.
My godmother had rung my parents' place on that Sunday afternoon, which was the 26th of October 1997. She was a little cryptic. She said something had happened in Canberra to Joe, and she asked me if I could meet her there the next morning.
The first task for Joe's family and friends was to identify his body in the morgue.
They pulled back the screen, and Maria was standing next to me, and Joe was on a stainless steel bed of some sort with just a slight purple vein running down the side of his face that was never there before, quite pale, hair pulled back, bare-chested, and was dead. Maria collapsed into my arms. I had to hold her up. She literally collapsed the moment she saw him. We were there for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. It seemed like an eternity, but it was probably 10 or 15 minutes, and she was grief-stricken, obviously.
He looked like he was asleep. How can you see a child you give birth to, you feed him, you look after him, you bring up a man? I had to put him in there whole day, and she's still alive.
We then went back to the headquarters of the Federal Police, where they started to explain what they believe had occurred. They had indicated that in a short period of time they had ascertained that Joe had not tried to commit suicide, that there had been some sort of foul play with Anu.
What Joe's family and friends were still to discover was that this was not a crime of passion. The suicide pact that Anu had been plotting had resulted in only Joe's death. And the evidence was about to reveal that it was a death that had been planned months earlier.
She's gone to the National Library, researched books on how to commit suicide. She had lessons in how to inject somebody with drugs. She had gone through friends to find drug contacts.
Perhaps the most chilling discovery the police made was that after months of preparation, Anu Singh had invited an audience. It slowly became apparent that the death of Joe Cinque was the culmination of a carefully staged drama on Antill Street, and it was Anu Singh playing the lead role.
You could not have written a more bizarre story. Who would ever imagine that it's a real life story to say someone held a number of dinner parties to farewell herself and to lead into the murder of a young man? No one could write that. If you wrote it, it wouldn't be believed. There was a general understanding among the party guests that they were going along to witness the lead up to a crime, and that this was going to be the night that Anu Singh was going to take her own life and take Joe Cinque's life in a suicide pact.
I believe there was some discussion about the reason they were there amongst some of them, but Joe was never aware of the reason for the party. He was simply attending because he lived at the house and Anu was his girlfriend. So as far as I can ascertain, he was not aware of the motive behind the party actually taking place.
Anu Singh, by this point, clearly had a reputation among her friends as creating drama. So whether they've come along to the party simply believing that it was all hype and talk and that no such thing was ever going to happen, who knows what was going through their mind.
So many people, many of whom were in fact intelligent students at one of the preeminent law schools in Australia, had gone along with her, who knew that she was at the very least planning perhaps suicide, and seemed blasé about that. They seemed, many of them, quite content to see Anu commit suicide and weren't prepared to do very much to stop her, even to talk her out of it.
I think the thing that concerned us as investigators was how a culture had existed where people could actually attend a party knowing that a death was going to occur, whether it was by murder or by suicide, and how people thought that it was okay to attend a party knowing that someone was going to die.
Tragically for Joe, Anu began to carry out her plan. Following the meal, and after the guests had left, Joe was given a sedative-laced cup of coffee that rendered him helpless.
What we learned was that Joe Chinque was in fact drugged that night. He was given Rohypnol, that heroin was prepared and put into a syringe, and that night Anu Singh did in fact attempt to kill Joe. My recollection of the evidence was that the heroin was so concentrated in the syringe that it's congealed, and that she wasn't able to inject him, that it was a failed attempt.
Joe Chinque woke the next morning with little more than a severe hangover, an effect of the Rohypnol he had been unwittingly drugged with. The previous evening, Joe and Anu had been surrounded by friends at a dinner party, and all of the guests were well aware of this abhorrent plan. So why did no one intervene?
It's a startling feature of this case that it took place when many of the close associates of Anu Singh were themselves law students at the Australian National University. They weren't junior law students, they were quite advanced in their law studies.
Here are these law students involved with drug abuse, involved with a whole series of totally irresponsible activities.
It is a very disturbing aspect to this case to recognise that you could have a group of people who are very clearly knowledgeable about the law to have colluded in such a way.
You don't see murder very often occurring among the more privileged young people of the world. You see killings occurring among the dispossessed and disorganised and dim and distressed. And this was different.
And one of the biggest questions that you're left with at the end of all this is just, why did nobody stop this? Why did so many people know what was about to happen and not do anything?
Anu's alleged attempt to kill Joe with the full knowledge of the party guests had failed. Incredibly, this didn't shake Anu Singh back to reality. Instead, she prepared for a second dinner party that Friday night, where once again, Joe Chinque was drugged and then injected with not one, but 2 massive doses of heroin. Again, no one tried to stop her.
After Anu had administered what she thought was a lethal dose of heroin on the Friday night, Joe was still alive on the Saturday in bed, tossing and turning. Again on the Sunday, still alive. Clearly, she hadn't achieved what she was hoping to.
Joe was desperately clinging on to life despite the massive heroin overdose he'd been given. As Anu witnessed his life slowly ebbing away, she finally reached for the phone. But the call wasn't to the emergency services.
On the 26th of October, Anu Singh calls a friend in panic. She's telling the friend over the phone that there's been an overdose. That friend says to her, "You need to call the ambulance." And Anu says, no, I can't. And the friend comes back at her and says, "You're a selfish bitch. You can't take someone's life." She tries to convince Anu to call the ambulance. She says, "If you do, you're going to have an angry boyfriend on your hands. If you don't, you're going to have a murder charge." And it was that phone call that prompted Anu Singh to finally call the ambulance. When the 000 call was played to court, I think one of the first things that Anu Singh says, fairly calmly, she indicates to the operator, "I'd like to report a potential overdose."
Yeah, can I get an ambulance, please? Well, he's not. He's vomiting everywhere. I have a person potentially overdosed on heroin.
Potentially overdosed.
Well, he's not. He's vomiting everywhere, blood and stuff.
The operator questions her, "Potential overdose? Can you tell us what you mean?" And then this wild swaying begins of her being dishonest. She gives the wrong address. She gives the wrong name. She calls herself Olivia. So she's actually impeding emergency services' attempts to get help to this man that she supposedly loves. She's screaming hysterically one second, she is talking calmly the next.
Can the police just tell me is that a bad sign?
Well, it's not good if he's vomiting blood.
She was swaying dramatically between expressing her love from Joe and then refusing to answer the questions.
Her unusual behaviour continued when the emergency services arrived.
It was a duplex building, so we went in the front door and called out, walked upstairs. There was one ambulance officer inside the bedroom, and there was a male casualty laying on the floor, and he was naked, and the ambulance officer was trying to get a line into his lungs. There was a lot of browny liquid fluid coming out of his mouth, so they were having trouble getting past all of that to get into his lungs. So he was obviously not conscious at the time, and there was no way that we were going to bring him round. The lady in the house was actually quite frantic, and she was pacing around, walking back and forward to the window, to the door, and she approached me a number of times, and one of the times she grabbed hold of my forearm and said, "He had a lot last night," and then to let go and walk back over to the window and just kept pacing around the room.
Tragically, and despite the valiant efforts of emergency services, Joe Chinque died that afternoon. The official cause of death was asphyxiation. Anu Singh was brought to the police station as officers tried to determine how this fit young man with no history of drug abuse had met his death.
I arrived at the police station, and when I saw Anu Singh, she was dressed in a flimsy white nightie. She was hot and sweaty. I remember her being clingy, sweaty, and she grabbed hold of me and held on to me. She sounded upset. She was asking what happened to Joe and these sort of questions. During this period, she still seemed restless.
As the interview progressed and police learnt more about the twisted plan Anu had hatched, more and more questions began to be raised about her story.
Talking to Anu about the suicide pact that was to occur, the question was often raised why she didn't continue through the suicide herself. Why was it only Joe? And that question remains today. And she never really answered that question. There was no real answer to it at all. There didn't appear to me anyway to be any sorrow in her voice. She was at points sobbing, but at no stage do I remember having to give her tissues or anything to wipe tears away.
Anu Singh's claim to the emergency services that Joe had died as a result of an overdose was quickly ruled out. She was charged with his murder that very same day. As detectives continued their investigation, an unexpected twist in the bizarre series of events emerged. Police began to realize that someone else could have been involved in the death of Joe Chinque.
It's been suggested that Anu's friends just didn't do enough to do something to stop her crazy plans. I formed the view that Anu had no friends, not in the real sense. She had people she knew from university, people she'd run into. Madhavi Rao was her friend in some respects, but Madhavi Rao was just her shadow. Madhavi Rao trolled around after her. She was in awe of Anu Singh. And she, too, just was swept up in the madness of what she was saying and what she was doing and planning.
We were aware that she was a very good friend of Anu Singh's at that time and had involvement in the preparation of the crime. I had been to the library with Anu Singh, had looked up how to inject heroin with other people. She'd been involved with purchasing the Rohypnol, and also her main involvement was preparing the parties, because Anu Singh at that stage really hadn't got people to come to the party. It was left to Madhavi Rao. She was the main person who got the party goers together, so to speak.
Following the police investigation, it was determined that there was sufficient evidence to charge both Anu Singh and Madhavi Rao with murder. They initially stood trial together in October 1998, But after 4 weeks, due to a legal technicality, the joint trial was abandoned. Now each woman would face a separate trial. Both exercised their right to trial by judge only.
In Canberra, it was the right of an accused to opt for a judge-only trial.
Anu Singh's personality, in some respects, was behind the decision to elect for judge-alone trial. I thought it would be very difficult to call her to give evidence in her own defence if that became necessary. She was not someone I thought a jury would find very attractive.
Anu Singh chose not to give evidence in her trial, meaning the court would not hear her version of events.
I never had a full proof of evidence from her. I had instructions in relation to aspects of the case that I particularly needed because I needed to cross-examine witnesses and put positive propositions to them. But at no stage, my recollection is, did I have a comprehensive from start to end narrative from Anu Singh herself.
Anu Singh's mental health at the time of Joe's death dominated the trial. To what extent did it play a part in the tragic events of the 26th of October, 1997?
The Crown case against Anu Singh was that her acts were deliberate acts of murder. They were premeditated, they were cold-blooded, and that she had made a long and detailed plan with a view to bringing about the death of her partner. But when it came to the motive was a bit thin on the ground. The most they could point to in large measure was that Anu thought in some way she had been made ill by some advice that Joe had given her to take ipecac syrup. And when you started analysing the alleged motive, it fed completely and utterly into the notion that she was mentally unwell.
She had the wherewithal to procure the heroin. She had the wherewithal to procure the Rohypnol. She had the wherewithal to plan not one but 2 dinner parties. So looking at that whole assemblage, she knew that doing what she did would result in death.
There was, in my view, no doubt that this woman had a significant mental disorder, which had been troubling her on and off for a number of years. This is why they went for diminished responsibility, not for insanity. I mean, her responsibility was diminished by the depression. It wasn't removed by the depression. Yes, this woman planned and carried out a killing. Yes, this woman told other people that she was going to kill this man. So there was very clearly a knowledge of what she was doing. The diminished responsibility simply says that the nature of this disorder was one which affected her judgment and affected other aspects of her mental function.
The judge accepted the defence had established that at all relevant times Anu was suffering from an abnormality of mind. He found that she was suffering from a borderline personality disorder of at least moderate, if not a greater extent, that she was suffering from depression, that she had an eating disorder, and all of those things meant, in his judgment, that her responsibility for the acts were very substantially diminished.
As well as trying to establish Anu Singh's mental state at the time of the killing, the court also faced another question. Just how was this tragedy allowed to happen in the first place?
There was a parade of law students from the Australian National University that came through the witness box telling how they had been invited to the party, how that it was not a secret, that it in fact was very open, that a crime would be committed. These people were questioned time and time again, why didn't you do anything about this? And I don't know that anybody ever got a satisfactory answer from any of those witnesses as to why on earth didn't anyone do anything to stop them. Anu Singh appeared to be so open about what her intentions were that it is mind-boggling that it was ever allowed to happen.
The people we interviewed that were at the dinner party, majority of them seemed very distant to their emotional attachment to the fact that there was going to be a murder or that there was going to be a death. Nowhere during that whole investigation, except for the Chinkways, were there any tears shed. So of all the people we interviewed, of all the people we spoke to who had close affinity to this whole crime, my memory is that not one tear was shed by these people for Joe.
Despite numerous witnesses who gave evidence at the trial, the spotlight was never far from the accused.
One of the strongest pieces of evidence that sticks in my mind is that Anu had told people that it wouldn't be hard to convince someone that you're crazy, that she had such a good knowledge of psychiatry, that she had a good knowledge of the law, and that if she had wanted to, it wouldn't be hard to convince somebody that she was insane. We were so close to Anu Singh sitting there when confronting evidence was heard. She would put her head in her hand. You could see her shoulders shaking, and then you would see her look around and look at you as if to say, "Are you watching me? Can you see me crying?"
On the 23rd of April 1999, Anu Singh was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Justice Crispin delivered a sentence of 10 years with a non-parole period of 4 years. Given the time that she had spent behind bars during the trial, she would serve just 18 months. To the family and friends of Joe Cinque, it was a devastating outcome.
I started to cry. I want to kill her. I really want to kill her.
The moment that the verdict came down, there was an eruption. And it was Maria Cinque and it was Nino Cinque, who rarely spoke. Just spontaneous explosion of hatred aimed at Anu Singh.
I know sometimes from someone who's not used to this, they say, well, you know, she planned it, she talked about it. Clearly, this is an intentional act. Yes, it is. Clearly, there's no excuse for that. But the law says, and I think rightly, that if you're significantly mentally disordered, such that if you hadn't been mentally disordered, you almost certainly wouldn't have committed those acts, then that does diminish your responsibility.
Someone who has sat there and premeditated, planned a party, how anyone could look at those set of circumstances and judge that to be diminished responsibility is beyond me. I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, but to me, that was premeditated. Is she sick in the head? Absolutely, she's sick in the head, but she knew exactly what she was doing, and given she knew what she was doing, she should pay the price.
When we heard the sentence, we thought it was a joke. 10 years and probation 4 years. Are you joking? You get for a dog, you get that long. He's a man. He was 26 years old. And he would live another 60 years for sure, and you give 4 years to her. What kind of... We scream and scream, and we couldn't believe it. And the police next to us there said, that's the way it is.
What the evidence pointed to us as police was a contrived crime. She'd moved studying it, understanding it, having parties, going and having heroin shots herself to see what the reaction would be and how to deliver heroin, trying it on Joe once, then trying it again. I think the normal public would ask themselves, how could a person walk away with just 18 months real time from that crime and then continue their life while someone had lost theirs and a family had lost their son.
Following the completion of Anu Singh's trial, it was the turn of her friend and alleged accomplice, Madhavi Rao, to face justice.
She was represented by Lex Lasry QC, and Lex raised technical legal arguments why Madhavi could not be guilty as an accessory or someone involved in Anu Singh's crime, and that was successful, and she was acquitted.
The judge's explanation was that there was nothing that could actually pinpoint Madhavi Rao in the room when Anu gave Joe the fatal injection that killed him at that time. I think people were astounded, and people still are astounded. I don't know if there's more unanswered questions in relation to the trial of Madhavi Rao than there is Anu Singh. At least Anu Singh got found guilty where this other person, where evidence had been produced that she had been with Anu Singh, that Marty V had been helping her find material at the library, had personally bought the Rohypnol, who had went round and had spoken to people about going to the party, how that person could walk away. And I think this is part of the enigma of all of this. How does Anu Singh get found guilty, no matter what the sentence was? And how did this other person walk free?
That question is just another reason why Joe's family and friends remain so frustrated with the justice system in Australia, and why today they still struggle to deal with their loss.
The injustice that is associated to his death again overlays all this. The fact that the Chinquay family feel absolutely betrayed by the justice system in Australia. The fact that there has been really nothing close to what they would call adequate justice for what she did. With Maria, what a lot of people don't realise is that she lost a child at the hands of someone she invited into her own home and embraced as potentially a daughter-in-law. She cooked for this woman, you know, an Italian woman, the way they express love is through cooking. And she sat at that very table where they still sit down every day and have their lunch, you know, and served her a meal. You know, the woman who was responsible for killing her son in the most brutal of fashions. He took 2.5 days to die. He was tortured.
When October comes, a terrible time. His birthday is worse. Nobody rings you. Either they remember or not, we don't know. You don't feel like go out. Even you see something funny, you start laughing, you stop. Because you think, no, I should not enjoy myself. I've got no right to enjoy myself. Because you think, why should I? I've got no right. It's not here anymore.
If anyone thinks they even mildly understand what she went through, think again. I would ask every mother out there to think about their firstborn son being killed by their girlfriend, a woman you invited into your own home, and taking 2 days to do it. No one can understand what she's been through. No one. I don't care what anybody says. No one can understand it.
You have to go through things like that to understand. People tell you, oh, understand. No, you don't understand until you go through. You don't know how bad it is losing a child. He was a person. He was my son, and he lived 26.5 years, and he's not here anymore.
We believe that she actually murdered him, and she took his body somewhere we don't know exactly.
He said, "I'll see you in a few months, Roscoe." And I said, "Good on you, Carl. Enjoy your time off." And that was the last time I saw Carl.
There was blood spots found on the wall of the master bedroom.
The essence of the case is to identify the important pieces of the jigsaw and put them together, and to produce one picture. The truth.
Carl Gotchins was a 51-year-old marine engineer from Yatala in Queensland. In July 1990, in the midst of relationship troubles, he was due to board a plane bound for Thailand. Almost 10 years earlier, Carl had left his first wife and their 2 daughters and started a relationship with Patricia Byers, who became his de facto partner. But by 1990, this relationship was also floundering. Carl had met a woman in Thailand, and he decided to end his relationship with Byers and move abroad to start a new life.
He'd been away on a trip. He'd returned to Harwood Island, and his employer at the time, Ross Roberts, had driven him to his house at Glen Osmond Road, Yatala.
When I dropped him home, he invited me in for a beer, but on the way to Brisbane, he had mentioned that he had been arguing a bit with Patricia, I suspect over the fact that he was going to Thailand, And I said, no, I don't think I'll come in. And that was the last time I saw Carl.
He'd booked a airfare to go to Thailand on Friday the 6th of July, and he'd arranged to meet his girlfriend, and he wasn't heard from again.
This tale of a relationship breaking down and a partner leaving for a new life is far from unusual, and the friends and colleagues of Carl Gotchins quite reasonably accepted it and got on with their own lives.
We realised Carl hadn't been there for a while. Trish said to us that he'd got involved a young lady in Thailand during his travelling, and that he decided that they'd part the ways and he would go and live there with her. We didn't think too much of it because he was away quite a lot and we hadn't any reason to, challenge or question what she said.
We all thought that Carl had just moved up into Asia to work in the marine industry, which is not unusual for people of his age or his experience. There's many, many men in particular living in Asia who are Australian marine engineers because they're very sought after because of their ability.
And that's where the tale of Carl Gotchins would end, if it wasn't for a bizarre series of events in April 1993 on the calm waters of Moreton Bay on the Queensland coast near Brisbane. By then, Gotchins hadn't been heard from in almost 3 years. Carl's former partner, Patricia Byers, had seemingly come to terms with his sudden decision to leave her, and she'd moved on with her life. Just a few months after his departure, she had begun a new relationship with fellow insurance agent John Asquith.
Patricia suggested that they go off for a romantic weekend on the boat. It was a lovely night. They had dinner on deck, they made love, they had a shower on deck together, and then they went to bed. The next thing that John Asquith knew, he woke up to discover that he'd been shot in the head. The bullet had actually, by some miracle, had actually shattered when it hit his head, and somehow it hadn't actually killed him. He couldn't see Patricia Byers anywhere, so he managed to clamber out onto the deck, and he found her there, slumped over. She said that she'd been knocked on the head and couldn't remember anything. She thought that they'd been attacked by pirates.
She had this story that they had pirates or somebody climb on board with her asleep at night and shot him, and she was drugged or she was drunk and didn't wake up.
Amazingly, John Asquith was alert enough and well enough to be able to call the Coast Guard and get help.
Local police responded to the alleged pirate attack with immediate suspicion. Whilst Asquith was lucky to be alive, medics could find nothing physically wrong with Byers, despite her claims of being attacked.
So the police obviously had to look at, what had gone on. Had there been pirates, although, Moreton Bay is not really known for piracy. Maybe it was kids fooning round, but again, there were no reports of that. So they had to look a little more closely at what had actually gone on. John Asquith claimed that he'd seen a gun below deck. But by the time the Coast Guard arrived, there was no sign of the gun. The Coast Guard actually searched overboard but couldn't find the gun anywhere. And Patricia Byers said that she hadn't seen it.
Asquith was convinced he'd seen a gun below deck, and the fact that it had now disappeared only intensified police's suspicions. Their concerns grew when they were made aware of Patricia Byers' behaviour towards her supposed lover.
Patricia Byers told John Asquith to retract his statement to police. She wanted him to lie and say he hadn't seen a gun on the boat.
Faced with a version of events that was becoming increasingly harder to believe, police decided to cast the net further in an effort to work out exactly what had happened on board the boat.
So one of the avenues of inquiry that the police did pursue was John Asquith's finances. You know, was there a financial motive that someone wanted him dead?
What police discovered was that Asquith had not just one life insurance policy in his name. They found there were actually 5. The first was taken out shortly after the start of their relationship. The last was dated less than a month before the ill-fated boat trip. All bore a signature that looked a little like Asquith's, but all were forged.
All of these had been taken out fairly recently, and John Asquith had no memory of having done so. So the question was, who would have had a motive to take out the life insurance policies? There were $275,000 worth of policy against John Asquith with false signatures. Someone had falsified his signature on these policies. Patricia Byers was involved in the insurance industry, and so she knew very much what she was doing when it came to things like life insurance. So looking at all the evidence the police had uncovered, it was pointing very clearly in the direction of one person, and that person was Patricia Byers.
This shocking turn of events confounded police, but their suspicions were confirmed when a chance discovery in a nearby river sealed Byers' fate.
Well, Ashley and my son had been down to the riverbank fishing with his mates. They'd found this rifle butt. Then subsequently they sent divers in and they found the rifle barrel in the river, which was stuck in the mud. And they put 2 and 2 together and said obviously a rifle had been sawn off.
Prompted by the ongoing investigation into Byers, forensic officers attempted to link the remains of the gun to their suspect.
And through some amazing investigative work, detectives were actually able to match the pieces of the gun that were found in the river with some shavings, wood shavings, that were found in the basement in a vise in the workshop at Patricia Byers' house. Forensics used that evidence to prove that it was the same gun that came from Patricia Byers' house that was used to shoot John Asquith.
With this piece of the puzzle, detectives could finally prove what had happened on board the boat that April night.
In reality, what had happened is that she and John Asquith had sexual intercourse, he went to sleep, and then she shot him. But the big mistake that she made is, well, first of all, she shot him at close range, but she shot him with a sawn-off gun. And the problem with that is that the muzzle velocity is a lot less than if she hadn't sawn it off. And luckily for John Asquith, he seems to have had a thick skull, and the bullet did not penetrate his skull.
Byers was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of John Asquith. In September 1994, she was found guilty and eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison.
John Asquith sat in the Supreme Court to see the woman he once loved sent to jail.
Just relieved that it's all over.
Her motive for shooting him was $270,000 from 5 life insurance policies she'd forged in his name. Byers testified that Asquith had actually shot himself as part of a conspiracy by the couple to defraud the insurers. The jury didn't buy the story.
With a cold, calculating woman behind bars, police closed the case on Patricia Byers. That was until the publicity surrounding the trial prompted the family of a man who hadn't been heard of for 4 years to contact the police.
When we saw the article in the paper in regards to the attempted murder of John Asquith, we finally had some sort of clue to go on about my father's whereabouts. We just thought the worst had happened to him.
After the conviction of Patricia Byers for the attempted murder of John Asquith, by happen chance, police had come into possession of knowledge or information that Patricia Byers had been living in the residence of a gentleman by the name of Carl Gottschens.
Some years earlier, Carl Gottschens' family had actually contacted Patricia Byers to ask where he was, as they hadn't heard from him for some time. Byers told them that they had separated and he was now living in Thailand. His family took this at face value until the news broke about John Asquith's attempted murder.
Even though he didn't have a lot of contact with his family, it was out of character that there'd been no contact for 4 years. There was no reasonable explanation as to why this man basically disappeared off the face of the earth.
Carl was the sort of fellow that I warmed to rather quickly. He was a very good engineer, good sense of humour, and wasn't frightened to speak his mind.
Carl was a very pleasant fellow, very serious sort of man, I would say. We didn't see a lot of him, a lot more probably of Trish than we did of Carl, because he was away a lot of the time. He wasn't on the scene. We didn't worry too much about it, because he was away for weeks on end and a couple of months on end sometimes.
Carl had been married before, and he and his wife had 2 daughters. Although the relationship had broken down, he kept in touch with his children. Shortly after the marriage breakup, Carl met Patricia Byers and fell in love.
So Patricia Byers was an insurance agent. She was married before when she was 19, and her first husband died, so she was a single mother with 2 children.
Although life as a single mother was difficult, she refused to let it get the better of her, and she began a successful career in insurance.
Trish was very sort of outgoing, but she was probably more interested in being with the men because she had more in common with them. She didn't see herself as a homebody. She's very interested in being out in the yard, doing the manly things like brush cutting and mowing and laying walls and things like that, you know.
So Carl Gotchins and Patricia Byers met at a sailing club. They were both very keen sailors. And Patricia, they built up a business together. They were in a de facto relationship together. They shared a house.
We built the house in '88, the same time as Patricia Byers was building their house with Carl. We sort of got friendly as the house was being built. As a neighbour, Patricia was very, very good. We had no problems with her at all. She was quite helpful. We did socialise them a little bit, didn't go much further than that, but we did have a couple of barbecues and we found them very sociable.
First time that I met Patricia Byers was she came to the ship with Carl to drop him off, and we actually went out to dinner. I found her a very pleasant person. I didn't sense any problem between them.
But by July 1990, Carl Gotchins had decided the relationship had run its course, and he was planning to leave Patricia Byers.
Their relationship started to break down, and he was out of the country at sea quite a lot of the time. And I think it was on one of those trips overseas, he was actually in Singapore working as an engineer when he actually met and fell in love with an Asian woman.
Carl was due to board a plane bound for Thailand, but he didn't make the flight. The 51-year-old marine engineer hasn't been seen since.
So when Carl Gotchins left Patricia Byers, it came as a bit of a shock to everyone. Patricia Byers told people that he'd gone off to be with this other woman and that he was going to be on a boat and sailing. And Carl Gotchins' ex-wife and children weren't able to get in touch with him. He obviously hadn't contacted them, even though he usually rang the daughters for their birthdays. So no one had actually heard from him for a long time.
Prompted by the Asquith trial, Carl's family reported him missing to the police, who immediately became suspicious and started delving into the lives of Carl and Patricia. It wasn't long before a dark and twisted picture began to emerge. It portrayed a woman whose greed would lead her to commit an unthinkable act. The first clue that would unravel the mystery of Carl's disappearance arrived in the form of a letter, seemingly written by the man himself.
Ross Roberts, who was Mr Gotch's employer, had a number of letters that he'd received purporting to be written by Mr Gotchins. One of those was a typewritten letter.
And the letter was basically saying that he was moving on, he was going to work up in Asia, he'd been paid out some money for his house, and thanks very much and see you later.
Dear Ross, I would like to hand in my resignation. Ross. I hope you will have time to find someone else. An opportunity has come up in Southeast Asia and I feel I have to take it.
This struck me as very strange because we'd never had this conversation.
This opportunity was too good to miss. One of the partners died and it had to be quick. I was also lucky Trish paid me the money all up front in cash. She's been terrific and maybe I've made a bad decision. I feel bad, but she is smart and good looking. I can't see her being left on the shelf. I wish you all the best. Give my regards to everyone. I will keep in touch. Regards, Carl.
To all who knew the missing marine engineer, the plans he'd laid out in the letter seemed completely out of character.
The next step in the investigation was contacting Department of Immigration to find out if he had left the country. On the 6th of July 1990, he never made that Thai Airways flight.
One of the first things they did was to contact his Thai girlfriend, and she actually said that she'd had a phone call from an Australian woman saying that there'd been an incident and Carl Gotchins would not be joining her in Thailand after all.
There was no evidence that Mr. Gotchins had ever left Australia, and there was no reasonable explanation as to why he had disappeared.
At the same time, police were beginning to intensify their investigations into Carl's finances.
We looked at his assets. He had a house at 25 Glen Osmond Road, Yatala, and we discovered that 3 weeks after he disappeared, the house was transferred to Patricia Byers' name. Bank accounts that he had in his name were activated. There was numerous cheques written on those accounts.
The more police investigated, the more they grew concerned for Carl's well-being. To detectives, the inevitable conclusion was that he had met with foul play. At the same time, one person was becoming the prime suspect. What police didn't yet have was a motive, but that was to change when a letter to Patricia Byers was discovered.
Prior to the disappearance of Mr. Gotchins, he had consulted his solicitor in relation to the separation from Patricia Byers. And there is a letter from his solicitor addressed to Patricia Byers, which states, "Our client instructs that the relationship between the two of you has broken down and the relationship which began in 1981 has now ended. Mr. Gotchins is hopeful that the relationship will end on an amicable basis, and the purpose of this letter is to set out our client's proposal."
This letter obviously unnerved Byers. In an attempt to find out how the breakup would affect her financially, she forged Carl's signature on a letter, securing access to his will.
Byers also knew that if Carl Gotchins simply died in an unfortunate accident, that she had to share Carl Gotchins' estate with his two daughters, and that wasn't enough for her.
So if Patricia Byers stayed with Carl Gotchins, she'd still get to enjoy the house, the lovely house, the boat, the car, all the trappings of a good life. If he died, she'd only get a fraction of the assets, the rest will go to the daughters. And of course, if he ran off with another woman, she'd be left with absolutely nothing at all.
At some point, she decided that Carl Gotchins had to disappear. The idea being he simply disappears, no one knows he's dead, and then she can use the opportunity then to transfer all the assets into her own name.
To the police, it seemed that Byers had motive enough to kill Carl, but they still needed proof, and so began months of painstaking work. While they may not have had a body, what they did have was a trail of paperwork that they hoped would lead all the way to the Supreme Court.
If there's no body, there are essentially two things that are central to the case. One, prove they are dead, as opposed to simply disappeared. And two, then you have to prove that they have been killed at the hands of a particular person.
From the outset, detectives began to discover evidence that pointed to Byers' involvement in the mysterious disappearance of Carl Gotchins.
When you look at the facts of the case, Ross Roberts dropped him at his home on Tuesday night, the 3rd of July 90. He'd made a booking to fly to Bangkok on Friday the 6th of July 1990. He never made that flight. Several weeks later, his house that he owned at Yatala was transferred to Patricia Byers' name. Accounts that he operated at a number of banks and a credit account that he had with American Express was activated. There was numerous transactions on those accounts. At the beginning of the investigation, the only suspect was Patricia Byers.
Now, the question for police was whether they could build a case strong enough to convince a jury that their suspect was in fact guilty of murder. Byers was still in prison, following her conviction for the attempted murder of John Asquith, and she wasn't saying anything about Carl's whereabouts.
The investigation had come to a point where I thought it was necessary to execute a search warrant at Mr. Gotchin's house at Yatala. Because we didn't have a body, there was the option that we might have to dig up the yard or search various places at the house.
There was some concreting done in the months following the disappearance of Carl Gotchins. The police did an examination of the house and the grounds and did not find the body.
And so began months of forensic investigation. They may have had no body, but what police did have were files of paperwork. These are some of the actual documents they discovered, revealed here for the first time, and they pointed to a chilling conclusion.
When I did a search warrant at 25 Glen Osmond Road, Yatala, there was a portable typewriter located at the address.
Investigators were already aware of the letter received by Carl's former boss that aroused suspicion. Was there a chance that it could have been written on this typewriter?
My examinations revealed that the typewritten letters were typed on this cheap manual portable typewriter. And there are a number of identifying features that, in my view, could say that that typewriter was responsible and no other typewriter.
The letter was purported to have been sent from Darwin, so it was odd that he's typewritten a letter in Darwin and the typewriter was found at his old address in Yatala.
By proving the letters had been typed on the typewriter found at Byers' home, detectives now had a forensic link between their suspect and the suspicious documents.
In effect, by that evidence, we could show that Patricia Byers was creating false leads or false trails to try and cover her tracks.
Spurred on by this discovery, detectives dove headlong into the financial affairs of Carl Gotchins.
The reason we went down the road of looking at his financial history was because when you look at the attempted murder of John Asquith, there was a financial element to that investigation. Investigators discovered that beneficiaries had been changed on life insurance policies and there were further life insurance policies that Mr. Asquith was unaware of. So it was a natural progression that we would look at Mr. Gotchin's financials. We got statements from his employer, statements from financial institutions. For a number of cheques that she'd wrote, we got statements from people that she dealt with, and it all led to Patricia Byers.
It was one of the biggest document examination cases in the criminal courts in Queensland, up to then and even since then. The forged documentation was used to transfer all of the assets of Carl Gotchins into the hands of Patricia Byers. That was the core part of the case.
One of the first tasks for police was to source documents that contained Carl Gotchin's authentic signatures. Once they had those, they then began comparing them to hundreds of documents that were flooding into the investigation.
In a lot of cases of forgery, forgers go about different methods. They use tracing lines or guidelines, or they use what we call simulations. They sit there and practice as best they can, using their own handwriting skills to imitate what the genuine signature looks like. Successful forgery, to beat a handwriting expert, is very difficult. As things progressed in that investigation, I became extremely familiar with Patricia Byers' handwriting and the way she forged Carl Gotson's signature. When Detective Rosemary Walker was bringing documents to me, I would immediately, based on my experience and knowledge of Carl Gotson's signature, that I could identify, that's a forgery, that's a forgery, that's a forgery. It's fair enough to say that she milked Carl Gotson's accounts by forging his signatures on his bank accounts and using his American Express card. But the really hurtful thing was she forged his signature on the title to his property, transferring the title to her. So, from the way I see it, her motive was greed.
The final clue that brought Patricia Byers' house of lies and deception tumbling down was forensic evidence found here in her home.
They found droplets of dried blood on the wall. After all those years, very small and only a few. But the important thing was when the DNA extracted from those droplets was compared with the DNA of Carl Gotson's daughters, those dried spots of blood were consistent with coming from Carl Gotson's. That combines well with the fact that Byers ordered a new bed within a day of the date that the murder probably happened. And obviously, why do you order a new bed? Because the old one is covered in blood.
Frustratingly for the police, the search of the house in Yatala failed to provide any clues as to the location of Carl's body. But despite this, the strength of evidence they did have was enough for the detectives.
She was removed from Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre to come to the Watch House, where I formally charged her with the murder of Carl Gotsons.
The trial of Patricia Byers began in 1999 and lasted for 6 weeks. Prosecutors alleged that Carl Gotsons was murdered between the 3rd and the 7th of July, 1990. Byers had cruelly but effectively hidden his death from his loved ones for almost a decade.
There was about 100 witnesses called for the trial, and each of them came along and gave evidence of their involvement in the case, from the family to the forensic experts to his work colleagues to Commonwealth agencies such as immigration.
You see, the problem for Patricia Byers was that to produce the story that Carl Gotsons had simply left her and gone overseas, she had to tell different stories to different people. The problem for her was that when you put all those stories together in the one room, it's very clear that she's not telling the truth. I said to the jury that there were a number of forces at work. Greed, jealousy, bitterness. But on reflection, there's something else at work there that's revealed in the forged letter that she sent to Carl Gotson's employer, where words to the effect of, "I might have made a mistake in leaving her, but she's smart, and I can't see her being left on the shelf." And one can't help but think that way of thinking is part of the reason for her bitterness and an element in the murder.
I find the letter to be quite self-serving in that Trish has described herself as being smart and good looking. I can't see her being left on the shelf. Yeah. I thought it was telling.
Despite protesting her innocence to the end, in 1999, Patricia Byers was found guilty of murdering Carl Gotsons and jailed for life by the Supreme Court in Brisbane. The jury were only told about her previous attempted murder conviction after she was sentenced. Carl Gotson's body was never recovered. The sole clue to his final resting place comes, oddly enough, from Byers' own hand.
I located a 1990 diary which had been kept by Patricia Byers. On the 6th of July 1990, she made an entry that Carl had left and she'd dropped him into the city.
And the note's interesting. She says, Carl left. And then she's got, dropped him in the city, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Drop him in the city is obviously code, particularly when you take into account the exclamation marks. Does it mean that she dropped him in the bay? Perhaps does the city actually have some meaning to her as some spot in the bay?
Other than this vague reference, Byers revealed nothing about what happened to Carl Gotchens. That was until 2016, when she claimed she was ready to reveal everything.
I find it very hard to imagine how someone could be so self-centred and so focused on money and so completely cold-hearted in getting rid of partners for cash. It's a frightening thing, and I think everyone is fascinated by the idea that someone who looks so normal could be a stone-cold killer at heart. Patricia Byers was in prison in Queensland for some years, but in 2009 she actually transferred to a prison in South Australia so that she could be closer to her son. Now, the interesting thing about that is in South Australia they have a law, no body, no parole.
The no body, no parole law is a South Australian law. It was brought into South Australia in early 2016. Queensland doesn't have no body, no parole. However, it applied to Patricia because she was domiciled in South Australia.
The fact that Patricia Byers transferred interstate to South Australia, where they enacted the no body, no parole legislation, has meant that she's had to admit to the murder of Carl Gotchens and provide an explanation as to where his body is.
Patricia Byers, in another twist in this very bizarre case, actually stepped forward and said, OK, I did do it. You know, I did murder Carl Gotchens. And this is a woman who had denied it vehemently and has always said, no, I had nothing to do with his death. Now, purely because of the parole laws, she has come forward and said, yes, finally, I did do it. And please let me out.
As a result of getting the request, Detective Scott Chapman went to South Australia and interviewed Patricia Byers.
She presented as a lady in her late 60s, early 70s. She was quite frail and also softly spoken. She agreed to participate in the interview, however, did not agree to it being recorded at that time.
Over the next few hours, Byers told her version of what had happened to Carl Gotchens.
She stated that she received a phone call from Carl Gotchens, who wanted to meet her at the Beanley rum distillery. She said it was about 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. She arrived there. She had a conversation with Carl and they decided to grab a 6-pack of beer and walk down to a wharf that was on the Logan River. Upon getting to the wharf, Patricia stated that her conversation with Carl became heated and she became very frustrated and very angry. She decided to walk away from the conversation. She returned to her car and she said there she went to the passenger side and removed a machete that she had underneath the passenger seat. At this time, Carl was sitting with his legs hanging over the edge of the wharf and looking out onto the river. She said she approached Carl from behind with the machete in her left hand and struck him on the back of the head. However, she stated she used the blunt side or the back side of the machete. She stated she didn't want to cut him and that she just wanted him gone. She said upon striking Carl, Carl fell into the Logan River, falling about 4 to 5 feet into the water below. She said she looked over the edge and Carl went under and never resurfaced.
After comparing her version of events with the evidence found during the murder trial, it was clear to detectives that Byers' story simply didn't ring true.
The scenario that was provided doesn't make sense. He was dropped it home on the Tuesday night. He didn't make the plane on the Friday afternoon. There was staining on the master bedroom floor which had been painted over. There was blood spots found on the wall of the master bedroom. That week there was a new bed that was delivered. So the scenario doesn't fit in with the facts.
My view is that it is unlikely that the body of Carl Gotchins is in the Logan River for the simple reason that it's a narrow body of water. It would be, quite frankly, a stupid place to dump the body because the body could easily be discovered.
Patricia advised us she was telling us the truth, and that she believed that DNA was in its infancy back then, and that she believed the case had been somewhat fabricated. I think it's a convenient answer for someone who doesn't want to disclose what's really occurred.
It doesn't make sense what she has said. It doesn't fit in with the facts. I don't understand why she just doesn't tell the truth.
Our suggestion back to South Australia in a nutshell has that she has not been truthful. With our investigators, with Detective Scott Chapman, she was not truthful with what we knew of the investigation, what we were able to prove forensically. That'll now be something that the South Australian Parole Board would have to consider. Only Patricia Byers would be able to tell us where Carl Gotchins could be, and we do not believe she's been honest with us up to this stage.
The location of Carl Gotchin's body remains a mystery. What is more apparent is exactly how Patricia Byers is viewed by those involved in her case.
I think Patricia Byers is a cold-blooded killer. While she's admitted to murdering Carl Gotchin, she hasn't admitted to murdering in the way that which we believe. So yeah, she's a murderer.
I don't understand why Patricia Byers just didn't accept that Carl Gotchins was going to leave her and let him leave the country. There was no reason for him to be murdered.
It's a vindictive, calculated crime by a woman who just had one thing in her mind, and that was financial gain.
And murder.
Yes, that's right, and murder.
She knew that the relationship was ending. She couldn't get what she thought she deserved simply by negotiating it with Carl. So she had to kill him. Simple as that.
The idea that Patricia Byers carried out this crime due to greed seems to have some foundation, particularly with the forgeries that have been uncovered in the evidence. It did point towards financial benefit. In that way, it's extremely sad that that's the price of a human life.
Hers is very much a cautionary tale that domestic violence and intimate partner homicide is a very shockingly common occurrence, particularly in Australia, and that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of suburban doors.
Never before, and really never again, has there been a crime of this nature actually perpetrated by a woman in Australia.
She's disgraceful. I can't comprehend what she's done.
Nothing could prepare you for what you were about to see. Whatever had done this, it was obviously a monster, and we had to do something. We had to somehow finish it.
The gentleman's head had been located.
There's a pot on the stove. I think I might have even said, so I'll give you one guess where the head is.
I was actually working at Muswellbrook that day and received a phone call at the station from a workmate of Mr. Price's.
We got the call from his boss to say that he hadn't come in and somebody had been out there and the ute was still in the driveway. They couldn't raise anybody. But, not thinking the worst thing, oh yeah, he's probably tied one on or something and hasn't woken up.
John Price is a 45-year-old who works in the local mines. Scott Matthews and Graham Furlonger drive to Aberdeen to investigate further.
I knew Mr. Price before. I knew that he was a hard worker and reliable man, so it was a bit unusual for him not to turn up for work and not to make a phone call.
I went up, knocked on the door, didn't get an answer, saw some blood on the door jamb. Looked through a little gap into the lounge room, which was dark, reasonably dark, and saw what looked like a bunched up curtain hanging down. Couldn't raise anybody, so I decided we'd go and break into the place, seeing as we had this complaint. I walked around the side, there was a piece of meat lying on the ground, and anyway, went round the back, broke in through the back door. As we went in, I saw straight ahead of me what I thought was a curtain.
There was something hanging, blocking my entry into the hallway of the house. I thought it looked like some type of blanket or some sort of covering that had been placed up on the archway. So I remember I used my left hand to push it aside, and immediately I could feel coldness coming on my left arm. So I looked down and my left arm was just covered in blood. Initially I thought I'd injured myself breaking through the back door, so I couldn't understand why my arm was bleeding.
As Graham and Scott try to locate the missing man, they are suddenly faced with the most horrific scene ever to be witnessed.
I realised then it was a human pelt. It was the skin minus the head. A full skin just hanging from the top door frame. Looked past it and saw a torso on the ground without a head and without any genitalia. And I think my first reaction then was to turn around to Scotty and say, "Don't look, Scotty." Of course, that's the worst thing you could say.
I could look through there, from there into the lounge room, and I saw what appeared to be, a human being, or what was left. And so it was at that point that I'd realised, what had happened. For something that I'd never seen before, I'd never experienced, I had an immediate idea of what had gone on. It was at that point that I drew my service pistol.
There was blood everywhere. A line of blood out from the door into the kitchen area. There's a pot on the stove. I think I might have even said to Scotty, "I'll give you one guess where the head is."
The scene is beginning to resemble that of a horror film. Yet amidst the carnage, the police uncover what appears to be elements of normal domestic life.
On the table there was a couple of plates that had meals already prepared and vegetables and meat cooked sitting there.
Sergeant Furlonger was talking to him. He was saying, "Look, it's going to be all right. We've got to keep going. We've got to finish this. We've got to do whatever it takes." He was talking to me, and I'm trying to hear if I could hear anybody else, because sometimes a little bit under stress, you get that auditory exclusion and you're not hearing things. You're just focused on the threat. It was quite a frightening experience, but once you've stepped into that situation, there's just no backing out.
As well as having to deal with a murder like they have never seen before, both officers still have no idea if the person who has carried out this slaying is still in the house.
So we went to search the place and we went up the hallway.
We heard what appeared to be someone snoring coming from one of the bedrooms, so we knew that there was someone alive in the house.
Looked in there and there she was lying on the bed. I tried to wake her. She was obviously drugged on something and couldn't wake her properly. She was very groggy.
She wasn't responding, so we carried her outside and put her under the back lawn. I wasn't sure whether she'd tried to kill herself with sleeping pills or whatever, but she certainly wasn't injured in any other way.
The woman who is unresponsive is 49-year-old Catherine Mary Knight. known locally to be the partner of John Price. Having taken what appears to be a concoction of pills, the police rush to call an ambulance. On closer inspection, nobody else is in the house. But who are this couple that had been involved in a scene of absolute devastation?
It didn't take too long to really discover that Catherine Knight was a woman who was quite a strong personality, was quite strong physically, who was well known around the town, as her family were, and also to build a profile on the victim, John Price, as well, what sort of person he was.
John Price and Catherine Knight began a relationship 5 years earlier, in 1995. Price having been married before, and Knight coming from a string of failed relationships.
He was hard drinking, hard working, which sometimes doesn't always run in line with each other. He was always the first at work, irrespective of how much he drank the night before. He would be up and he would be at work doing his job, and normally the first one there. He was a bloke who loved a beer and a smoke, in the sense that, and that's what he enjoyed, I think, initially in his companionship with Catherine Knight. And that's what it was all about. Didn't want to have too many cares in the world, and I think when Catherine came along, she filled in that final little gap.
Their relationship was quickly established and frequently involved having a good time and socialising.
Their circle of friends were all of the same ilk. They were all fast-talking, swearing, tough people. They did use rough language. They did have rough, tough mannerisms. They were loud and they were boisterous, and when they were throwing a party, everybody knew about it.
But cracks soon began to appear.
She was quite a violent woman. She was quite highly strung. She was quite jealous with all of her partners, and she was, at times, was certainly quite vindictive in her actions against those partners, both physically and mentally.
This volatile nature displayed by Knight soon escalated, resulting in bizarre behaviour.
Everything's about revenge and entitlement with Catherine. She's like a B-grade movie in that respect. Pricey had done the wrong thing by her. I think he tried to leave her once, or, he'd been at the pub too long. So to get revenge, she got the video camera and she videoed a first aid kit she thought that he'd stolen from the mine, I don't know, $20 first aid kit. She took the video of it to the mine's management. And Pricey got sacked for it, lost his job over it.
That is a pretty catastrophic thing to do to a man. It's, ending his livelihood, ending her livelihood as well. Again, that's the curious element of Catherine. She's quite happy to, hurt even those like herself to get vengeance on somebody else. There's no barrier for her that she won't cross. Pricey's mates all said, mate, get rid of her, she's bad news. Things that she was saying and trying to set him up as having stolen, and in fact he hadn't stolen them at all. There was an out-of-date first aid kit that was at the mines which had been thrown out.
Despite what Knight had done to Price, this didn't signal the end of their relationship.
Pricey threw her out for 3 months, but then he took her back. He lost a lot when he took her back. He'd already lost his job because of her. Then he lost respect of a lot of his mates because he'd taken her back. And his mates couldn't believe that he would do that. He couldn't drink at the pub. He had to change pubs because his mate said, you can't have her back in your life. What are you doing, We've nursed you through the last lot of grief, and here we go again, So there's a sense of it all closing in on Pricey. And when he makes that decision to get rid of her the last time, he knows it's not going to be easy, and I think it dawns on him pretty quickly that it's going to be really messy.
Knight was gradually striking fear into her partner, a fear that would culminate in Price resorting to desperate measures.
Pricey had started to confide in his bosses that he was incredibly worried about what was going to happen. He told every time she thumped him or yelled at him or, you know, exacted something else, he rang a mate and said, this is what's happened. And he said, if something happens, I want you to be, you know, to bear witness to what's been going on with me for the last couple of years with this witch of a woman. In the meantime, this vengeful woman has called the police and they've arrived, and he said, I want her out of the house. And they said, you have to get a court order to get her out of the house, which infuriated him. It was his house. She didn't live there on a permanent basis.
In the last 36 hours, he knew something was up. He was trapped.
2 nights before he was killed, they'd had a row. She'd held a knife up at him, and he fled the house thinking that she's going to stab him. And he went over the road to his mates and said, you know, she's come at me with a knife. The next day, the police rocked back up to Pricey's with an AVO that they, by law, had to take out on her behalf because she had called the police and she had accused him of being violent toward her.
Despite the restraining orders and involvement from the local police, Price chose to maintain contact with Knight. With the intimidation and violence escalating, it appears the local miner had a real sense of dread that his partner was capable of anything.
Monday, he goes into work and his boss can tell that this is a man who is clearly rattled. They hadn't seen him this rattled in all the time that they've been working with him. And they said, mate, what's up? And he sat down and he told them what she had done, and he said to them, I reckon she's going to do me in. The next day he went to court. This is the day that he was killed. He went to court and he sat down with the chamber magistrate and said, this is what's happened. He told the magistrate that the night before at 2 a.m. in the morning, he's woken up and there she is standing at the foot of the bed with her hands behind her back. And he said he leapt out of bed. He was terrified. He thought she had a knife. He thought that was the night that she was going to do him in. And he said only when he got sort of closer to the mirror, he could see she had nothing behind her back, that, you know, the terror, the instant terror stopped. But he couldn't get her out of the house. She just would not go.
Despite legal notices served to both of them limiting contact, they seemed to ignore these, which was to result in devastating consequences. The day before his brutal murder, a final comment made by Price would send chills down the spines of everyone that knew him.
Pricey had gone over the road with 2 beers to see his mate and to tell his mate, mate, if you see my van out the front in the morning when you get up to go to work, call the cops. She's done me in.
We started to get some statements from witnesses. We needed people who were close to the family, so we dealt mainly with the family of Catherine Knight and the family members of John Price.
As the investigation gets underway, Knight is kept under close supervision in hospital, suffering from the effects of the drugs she has taken.
Catherine Knight was basically in custody, but for some time she's going to be laid up. She's going to be possibly unconscious. That gave us a little bit of breathing space. We knew that we weren't going to get a chance to interview or even begin thoughts of interviewing Catherine Knight until she was completely well enough.
Whilst detectives wait to interview Knight to see what she will reveal, forensic investigators arrive to look for any clues that can determine what has actually happened in the house.
I got a phone call from VKG, which is police radio, telling us there'd been a murder. And I said to the operator, well, how do you know it's a murder? He said, well, he's been decapitated.
With the graphic description of how Price has been found, Peter Muscio is expecting a gruesome scene. But nothing can prepare him for what he is to see next.
We came in through the laundry at the back of the premises, and there's an aroma, and it was quite a macabre thing. It's a sweet odour, nice odour, as if Mum's cooking a stew.
Just like his colleagues before him, Peter is soon to discover the grim reality of the smell lingering in the kitchen. But he is first confronted with the rest of the killer's destruction.
Walk inside and one of the first things you see is Mr Price's skin or pelt hanging from the door, from a meat hook. I searched through the pelt for Mr Price's genitals. Further into the kitchen you could see blood staining on certain items. Into the lounge room there was a body. Further down the hallway there was blood staining down towards the bedrooms. You could see where I think Mr Price has gone for the light switch. There's blood staining on the light switch and also blood that he coughed or something onto the wall. You could see this expiration mark on it.
Analysing the scene, Peter tries to retrace Price's steps. The victim has firstly been attacked whilst lying in bed, then has tried to run for his life.
But as you go out towards the lounge room, this blood stain is getting heavier and heavier. Big swipes on the wall where he's blood-soaked himself and sliding against the wall. It's also getting lower, as if he's sort of... And it comes to a culmination at the foyer where he's just succumbed to his injuries. He's actually opened the front door and there's blood spatter on the screen door, so he's nearly made it out. Not that it would have helped him, he would have died certainly, but you just see the enormity of where it starts in the bedroom and just progressively worse and worse until you get to that point where he's died. The blood pool, it was the width of the hallway, which is probably 1.2 metres wide.
John Price has been stabbed 37 times, and the attacker has shown no mercy, continuing with the most barbaric acts. As if the crime scene could not get any worse, Peter has the difficult task of examining the remains of the victim's body.
When we examined the body, you could see the body has been there in its entirety. There was a big stain on the floor where the head would have been. It's been skinned first. You can see where she'd placed the skin on the carpet to set it there, and it's quite a substantial staining. There's also an outline of the head, so she's then taken the head off there. You can see where she's walked in carrying it to the kitchen. There's a drip, 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 drip of blood all the way leading to the cooktop. But until we actually lifted the lid off, it wasn't confirmed.
The killer, having already decapitated and dismembered this man, hasn't stopped there, as the police are drawn to something else in the kitchen.
They go in and there's a meal on the table, for God's sake. There's vegetables, there's gravy, there's his meat, which he's cooked in the oven. If you saw it in a horror movie, you'd almost laugh because it's just so over the top. These are the things those coppers saw that day, and these are things that never leave them.
To me, they were a statement. She had cut, I think it's the glutamus maximus, the doc called it, off his backside, and it's a big muscle, and she's cut that into 5 different steaks, and she's cooked them, baked them in the oven. 2 of them were on one plate, 2 on another plate, and the 5th one was out for the dog, I believe. But it wasn't touched. But the meals were there like a trophy. They had the names of each person who was supposed to get them.
The names displayed with the meals are 2 of John Price's relatives, prepared and arranged, ready for them to come in and discover. But neither meal has been touched. Despite the confronting crime scene, Peter and his colleagues still have to gather what evidence they can.
In the kitchen there was items that had been used. There was a jug with blood-stained handprint on it. So you collect that gets processed further back at the lab. A lot of the items were taken back, like the knives. There's a honing steel. There's also a sharpening stone. Like we had to get DNA material from all of those. There's a piece of cooked meat out on the backyard, so we collected that.
As the harrowing nature of what has happened begins to sink in, Bob Wells gets the chance to interview their prime suspect.
I got the opportunity to interview Catherine Knight about 5 days after the incident. Even though it was a lengthy interview, it didn't take us very far in relation to any admissions by Catherine.
Can't remember anything.
Do you recall yourself going to bed?
Faintly.
It was always maintained by Catherine during the interview that she couldn't remember anything.
Knight isn't giving anything away about what has happened. But in a lengthy interview, remarkably, she does accept that she has killed John Price.
Catherine presented me during that interview with this scenario that I needed to go and explore. That perhaps that she believes, or was claiming, that she committed this act because of the severe ongoing domestic violence she had incurred during her life, and more recently with John Price and other partners.
She has a rat cunning that she won't then go on and say, yes, this is why I did it. So she's never given the family piece, you know, about why she did it. She's never been honest about it. You know, she blamed him by saying that he had been violent towards her.
As Bob Wells explores Knight's suggestions that she was in fact the victim of domestic abuse, more unbelievable details are revealed about the night before the murder, with Catherine taking others out for a meal.
Back at the daughter's house, she set up a video camera. She loved that video camera. And she started recording things. There's always a sense of entitlement with Catherine. There's a sense that I own this, I'm owed this, you know, this is mine. Almost like a will, that this is yours, don't let anyone take it from you.
It was quite bizarre. It was like a sort of she was leaving little bits and pieces of property, and it was sort of like a last will and testament of what Catherine was going to, wanted to portray.
She had been planning this for days. She watches a video, drives to Pricey's home, wakes him up, watches a bit of Star Trek, has sex. She remembers him going for a pee, and then he lays back in bed, and then she strikes.
The slinky black negligee was later found to have sperm on it. It was found in the bathroom where we believe she showered. I believe we had samples taken from under her fingernail.
During the whole gruesome process, police believe Knight has washed, changed her clothing, and stolen her partner's wallet, before leaving the house to do other things.
We know that she left that crime scene at least once, and that was to take her car back to her home in McQueen Street and park it well up into the backyard, which is another indicator that, to us, that it was her possession, it was going to remain her possession. There was also the fact that Price's bank account had some money taken out at, I think, about 12:15 a.m. in two $500 lots, which we believe Catherine did at an ATM in Muswellbrook.
The money was never found. Where did it go? Did she take it somewhere and give it to somebody? Did she bury it somewhere?
The disappearance of large sums of money is just one mystery baffling the detectives. And now, days after the carnage, Bob Wells finally has the opportunity to ask pressing questions to their only suspect. But despite admitting to killing her partner, Knight presents an alibi that makes her the victim, not John Price.
Could it be the case that John Price was a victim of his own severe domestic and violence towards Catherine Knight, and she snapped and couldn't take it anymore? Which gave me the opportunity then to say that I then built the profile around Catherine Knight from the information she provided me during that interview. Interviewing the other partners, it became quite apparent that Catherine Knight, rather than being the victim of domestic violence, was more and more was the perpetrator of domestic violence in their relationships.
Catherine Knight had previous relationships with 3 other key men, marrying her first husband in 1974, meeting her second partner in 1986, and her third 4 years later in 1990. But would each partner reveal a similar pattern of behaviour experienced by Price?
These were blokes who were pulling the shirt across after they'd been stabbed by her. I mean, blokes who'd had their heads caved in with a frying pan, as Khaled had infamously. I can't imagine that many men are physically intimidated by their spouse. It must be a very small group. And it's even harder to imagine when blokes like these, hard Aussie blokes, but they lived in fear of their lives.
They had simple needs, beer at the end of, a hard working day, a woman who was there for them at home, and, somewhere nice to stay. So it was really quite extraordinary. She wasn't a great intellectual. She wasn't the sharpest pencil in the box by any standard. She didn't have great sort of, conversational skills up at the pub where she'd go. She just had this allure about the sex. She didn't care when she crossed the line. That was the whole thing. She was completely without remorse when she would do these terrible things. She would go back and ask these men to come back to her, but it wasn't, oh, I'm really sorry for what I did. It was basically, come on, come back, we've got to stay together.
As more unravels about this volatile woman, it is clear her irrational behaviour started when she was young.
With Dave Callett, they certainly had their ups and downs, but their relationship lasted a while. He was the first one to get the hint of how violent she was, and it apparently happened on the wedding night when she tried to throttle him because she'd heard some story that on wedding night Mum and Dad had had sex X plus 6 times, and poor old Callett conked out after 3 goes or something because he'd been drinking for 2 days. I think he was smart enough to know that the only way he was getting out of that relationship alive was to run away, and he did. She placed the first child on the railway tracks where the coal trains go through. That was all in response to Callett leaving her. This is probably the first public demonstration of just how excessive Catherine could be.
Endangering her baby's life landed Knight in a psychiatric unit. An extreme measure that drove Kellett to change his mind about the relationship and go back to her. But this didn't last for long. In 1986, Knight met David Saunders, a local miner.
They were madly in love in the early days, but like all of Catherine's relationships, the honeymoon period generally lasted 1 year to 18 months. It didn't last much longer than that. And in her mind, it would always be that they're cheating on me, even when they weren't, or that they're not spending enough time with me.
And Knight's irrational nature exploded in the most disturbing way.
He went out and cut his dog's throat.
Was the dog dead?
It was a clean cut, they said.
One of them has been stabbed in the stomach with scissors. She's sliced a puppy's neck, killing a young puppy at 8 weeks old because she was cranky. I mean, they just went back time and time again.
Saunders had to run away and hide. When he left her, he hid in another town. He pretended he was somewhere else. He put up this elaborate facade.
After that relationship broke down, Knight soon moved on to her next with a former co-worker in the local abattoir.
She left John Chillingworth, She said, I don't want you, and she cheated on him with one of her other partners in between, So it's kind of like, I think she was just getting to that point where she was desperate. Her looks were leaving her, such as they were. There was not that many options around in town. I think most of the menfolk of Aberdeen and the Hunter Valley had got her measure by now. They knew of her reputation. They knew that, she wasn't shy with, landing a fist on their face or, stabbing them with whatever implement she could get.
This window into her checkered past is now revealing a woman who has resorted to extreme violence throughout her life, often with no remorse or consequences. Separate to her volatile relationships, an insight into her personal and professional life may also shed light onto her unusual character.
Aberdeen's, in its early stages, was a farming area with a large abattoirs where Catherine worked.
Knight had worked in the local slaughterhouse for years, starting as a general labourer in 1971. It was not long before she progressed to the offal room, working on animal carcasses before honing her skills as a meat slicer in the boners room. This was her trade for over a decade. But could her diligence at work have masked or encouraged something more sinister?
She had an obsession with death. She loved to nick arteries in the abattoir and scrape the marrow out. I mean, who loves working in an abattoir, for God's sake?
She had this fascination with knives, and it was quite apparent that she could handle a knife.
This morbid fixation with the macabre side of life is also evident when officers search Knight's own home, just down the road from Price's in Aberdeen.
It was quite a bizarre premises, and we found that Catherine had a severe fascination with violent and bizarre movies, which she retained on VHS. The house that she owned is just full of macabre stuffed animals. It's quite a dark, gloomy house. It didn't give you a feeling that it was ever vibrant, open and light.
And extensive police inquiries with family members reveal some shocking warning signs from Knight. Could the writing have been on the wall for some time?
Catherine was workshopping the crime in her own mind and, just dropping hints to the family here and there.
There was information from her brother that she did say those particular words, that she would kill Pricey, and she'd get away with it because they'd think she was mad. There was other comments, if Pricey takes me back, he takes me back till the death.
With these admissions, along with all the other evidence, would Knight admit to her barbaric act in court? Less than 1 year on from the death of John Price, his family and friends must face seeing her in court.
At no time, either as a barrister or as a judge, did I ever strike anything of the horrific nature of Catherine Mary Knight's case. She pleaded not guilty, and the trial began in the conventional way. She sat in the dock. She was quite small, unimpressive. In a crowd, you would certainly never notice her.
Despite admitting to killing her partner during the police interview, Knight still enters a not guilty plea. But as the trial commences, she sensationally does a U-turn and asks to change the plea to guilty, but doesn't give a reason.
I was somewhat nervous about this because I was concerned that if I took a guilty plea, sentenced her, she would then appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeal and say she was insane at the time that she made the plea of guilty. I decided that I should get a court expert to examine her. And the psychiatrist came to exactly the same conclusion as the other psychiatrist that had seen her, namely that she was not insane, she was quite sane, but she was a bad woman.
Remarkably, despite the severity of Price's injuries, Knight has carried out this sustained and calculated attack with a sane mind. However, the court does reveal something else about Knight.
3 psychiatrists all diagnosed her with a personality disorder, which is not a psychiatric illness. It's actually it's a disorder of the way you relate to other people, and that's what she was like. If she didn't get her own way, if you crossed her, or if she imagined that you had, done something or said something about her, she would get payback.
Justice Barry O'Keefe allows a guilty plea and the jury is dismissed. But the graphic evidence is still heard.
Throughout the whole of the evidence, it didn't matter what a witness said, she didn't look at the witness. It didn't matter what the photograph or the video was, she didn't look at that. She sat looking straight ahead, absolutely impassive. There was never a sign on her face of any reaction to any of the evidence.
There was one time, and I believe it was when they were describing the crime scene, or it might have even been the crime scene tape, where she started rocking violently backwards and forwards and wailing and falling on the floor and really carrying on a treat.
This outburst is in stark contrast to the killer's usual measured behaviour. But Knight knows exactly what she is doing.
When she wanted an adjournment, she manipulated her behaviour so that she got it. Thereafter, she resumed the same mien as she'd had before, but I didn't think she'd switched off.
Eventually, in a highly charged courtroom, the judge reveals the sentence to be handed to this killer.
To sentence any person to life imprisonment is a big thing. To sentence a woman to life imprisonment, for me, was an even bigger thing. This was as bad a case as you got, so she had to go to jail for the term of her life.
Catherine Mary Knight is the first female in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole.
Today she became the first woman to be jailed for life under truth in sentencing laws, ensuring she'll die behind bars. She's been branded a danger to the community, capable of murdering anyone who crosses her.
She'd shown no remorse. She had not acknowledged that she had any problem at all. Such a person, if released, is not unlikely to do the same again. There's the real prospect of it.
There was a lot of cheering by family members and those sorts of things. But I was quite happy that, that we'd done a successful job and that justice was done in the end and that Catherine Knight got what she deserved. The little unturned stone for me is that the missing link from Catherine not saying and filling in that gap. When I was interviewing Catherine, you can catch someone's eye and you say to yourself, I'm being bullshitted to here. It's a combination of catching their eye, catching the expression on their face, that you know that this person is feeding you only what she wants to feed you. And that's why I still believe that Catherine would now be able to provide information as to what took place and why it took place.
Knight failed in an appeal of her sentence and will never be released. She takes to prison many secrets as to her motivation and reasons for ending someone else's life so brutally. And the mystery of Price's missing money on the night of his death still remains.
Catherine Knight doesn't make mistakes. She doesn't do things by accident. She has a well thought out plan and she executes it the way she wants to.
I can tell you that I found this a very stressful matter. In fact, after it was over, I didn't eat meat for about 3 months. The thought of meat reminded me of the events in this house.
She's not just a woman who's capable of violence or a woman who's capable of murder. She's a woman who revelled in this macabre, sinister, disgusting behaviour that is off the scale, that we cannot permit in a civilised society.